Return of the Exiled, or Why Must I Be the Hero? By Ch.6. Read by YOB. Dedicated to Kurt Reimert, whose stories inspired this work. Requiescat in pace. Chapter 6. Sard of the Falcon Legion. So there I was, back in his cell, and if Commander Felkor heard about it, I would die there, of that I was sure. Back at Green Creek Station, Colonel Falkor and Sergeant Halgan had made quite a point of seeing that I got no chance to defend myself against the phony charge of robbery they had leveled against me. They had thrown me into the smallest cell to wait for the prison caravan to take me to Stony Point Military Prison, with many a hint that I would not survive the journey. They had branded the word thief on my chest and mocked my pain and humiliation. Bastards. I had waited until Sergeant Halgan had been watching the guardroom cell to break out. No point in getting an innocent in trouble over my misfortune. Sloppy, arrogant Halgan wanted a chance to insult me further, or he would not have relieved the guard on duty. Getting out had been easy. Halgan was quite a drinker, and his drunken insults covered the sound of the large stone I managed to pry free. Then I quickly slipped out through the hole and pulled the stone back into place with my belt. I will have to send word to them about the need for repairs on the guardhouse. I slipped into the quarters I shared with Lieutenant Fell and put on his extra brigandine. He owed me a favor anyway. I added a helmet I'd been repairing. Thus equipped, I looked like other soldiers. I shattered one of the sentries and let myself down from the western watchtower. Quickly and quietly, I slipped across the pale and into the dark woods. At one point, I thought I'd been caught. A band of renegade soldiers attacked me and tried to rob me. The unlooked-for assistance of a stranger named Leo turned the fight and allowed me to escape. I owe him a debt of honor if ever we meet again. A few days later, a farmer's wife set me down to a fine meal, but wanted a little too much attention from me in return. I will never understand why women feel the need to cheat on their husbands. I avoided any more farms. A change of clothes and trading a little work for some silver to get me to Ty and across the river, that had been my plan. There could be no thought of going home under the circumstances. My father would be outraged and humiliated. I could not allow that. But stopping in Riston City for food and supplies had turned out to be a mistake. The local guards robbed me, beat me, and then threw me into the dungeon as a vagrant. Dishonorable oafs. Now I must escape before they find out who I am and discover the awful brand on my chest, which identifies me as a thief. I have been counseling with some of the other prisoners, mostly local farmhands and tradesmen, who have also been robbed and imprisoned by the guards. There must be a way to escape these simple thugs. Suddenly, Riff, a big farmhand I had been counting on for muscle, called my attention to the fact that they had called away all but one guard on our cell. The time to move was now if we were to have any real chance of escape. A gnomish thief had the idea of luring the guard to the door with a woman, better still, a girl. A girl was found, and Riff and the gnome waited beneath the window of the cell in order to snare the guard. A caravan guard named Bud and I waited nearby to assist them if need be. They managed to rush the guard and get the key. It was a close thing. The gnome had almost bungled it when he dropped the key, but they got the door open and all pushed through into the lower passageway. Sounds of approaching guards meant that an easy escape was no longer possible. A door I spotted down the passage turned out to be a storeroom for the possessions of the prisoners. 3 guards were rifling through the items stored there, and for a moment I thought a fight was going to happen. Instead, the bait girl proved to be death incarnate, and the guards died before they could raise an alarm. I was truly aghast with the effectiveness of this slip of a girl, slaying 3 grown men before my men had even become aware that she was among them. By the one god's beard, I'm glad I was not in her way. We found some weapons, and I snatched up my brigandine from a shelf. Bud grabbed a stout sword, dagger, and a leather jerkin. We left the room in the opposite direction of the sounds of returning guards. The passage was mostly dark, and there were few options. A low side passage appeared, and up to our right we all fled down a flight of crumbling stone steps. They led down into some abandoned section of the dungeon that I had doubts about. Just as I thought we were trapped, someone found a secret door leading further down. Then our torch went out. I am glad that Lieutenant Fell taught me how to light tinder from a knife hilt, rubbing on stone. We got a candle lit. A great deal of steps and a long passage followed. Any further down, and I swear we would have reached the pit itself. Pressing on, we came to an ancient crypt in the basement storehouse of a temple. Here we were caught, and I cursed myself for carelessness at not having the gnome scout ahead. Some questions were asked, but not to the point of an interrogation. Oddly, the priestess who found us didn't report us to her superiors. It seemed to me that this meant she was eager as we to avoid having the situation known. This could be a bargaining point and let us get some control over the situation. And just as I predicted, she wanted to go with us to Tai and was willing to assist us in exchange. Some food was brought, and she left us for the night. I had everyone get some sleep. The following morning, she again brought us a meal. She let us gather some supplies. We found our way back through the catacombs. A side passage led to an exit just south of the city. Truly, that was the best sunshine and fresh air that I have ever beheld. Almost immediately, this priestess Debrina started causing trouble, trying to give orders to the men and I. No matter how hard I tried to explain that I and my men were not to be ordered about like simple servants, she kept behaving as though she were somehow in command of the operation. Absurd. She had brought along a youth who was supposed to be a magician for the men and I to care for, and the girl who we had used as bait in the garden cell had tagged along as well. The winter rain started, and this did nothing to improve my mood. I should have stayed in the damned dungeon. If I had not made promises to the other men, I could duck into the woods and make my own way without this silly young woman and this hopeless youth to worry me, I thought. Although I knew I would not actually abandon them, it soothed me to think about it. The bait girl, for so we had begun to call her, could most likely fare well on her own, it seemed, after watching her butcher those 3 guards without help. 4 of the men left to return to their jobs as farmhands, or maybe to leave Debrina and her trouble behind. These were the ruffians and worthless laggards anyway, so I mourned not the loss. 10 of the men from the dungeon said that they wanted to follow along to Sersha and start new lives. Good men, I think. Despite our not running into any patrols, it was a long trip to Tai, with Debrina constantly trying to nag me about each decision. If I said we should parallel the road to the east, Debrina would say we should stay west. If I said we should sleep in the farmer's hay barn to keep warm, Debrina would say we should stay in the forest, out of sight. Well, at least she's good at collecting food from the wilds. Winter was not a good time to be in the forest. Cold and wet, lousy traveling. When she suggested that we split up on entering Tai, I knew I should have not allowed it, but the chance for some peace was too great a temptation. As it was, I chanced to encounter a merchant who was attempting to load his wagon with heavy barrels of wine, and struggling. It was clearly a 2-man job. It seemed that the youth he had hired to assist him had taken his money and disappeared. After a bit of deal talk, the merchant said that he would trade a belt, wineskin, and tinderbox for assistance in loading his wagon. The gnome had tried to buy passage for us on a Circean trading ship. The first mate had taken his money and given him a false leave time. The ship simply sailed away without us. Typical Circean third-rate sailor. My father wouldn't hire such scum. Debrina did better. First, she had found a cloak to hide her temple robes, one of her better ideas. Then she found a fisherman who would give us all of us passage as close to Sersha as he could get by following the shoreline to a small unknown inlet and asking only a few coins, which Debrina had with her. Having traded some more labor for a decent meal, I was in a good mood and kept my thoughts to myself about Debrina having made the travel arrangements. She and Tennard the youth were apparently going further with us. Debrina explained that she had seen familiar faces from her temple in town and could not stay here. As soon as all of us were aboard, we set off for Sersha. Unfortunately, a patrol boat spotted the small craft and we had to paddle for shore on a small skiff that the fishermen loaned us. Finally, the magician proved his worth. He cast a push spell, which moved us all along much faster than we could paddle. Thus, we managed to reach the inlet and land without the patrol spotting us. We hid in the abundant scrub until the patrol boat and the fishing boat had disappeared. I sent a couple of men to scout for any patrol from either Tor or Sersha. Then we headed west, in the direction of a village one of the men knew from traders he had been speaking with. We needed to be further inland as soon as possible. As soldiers from Tor were known to visit these trading centers near the border, I sent Debrina and Tennard in ahead of us to make sure that it was safe. It was not. At the tavern, a grand fight was being had between the soldiers of Tor and Sersha. As the trading post was in the back of the tavern, Debrina elected to wait until later to trade for supplies. Meanwhile, back in the forest, the men made camp and searched for wild edibles or anything useful. I kept feeling that I was being watched. Not anything I could see or hear, it's just my soldier sense of not being alone. The next day, the Tor soldiers had left and Debrina traded for food, blankets, candles, and other things we needed on the road. It would have been better if she'd gotten some rope, but we needed to get away from the border as soon as we could. I still could not shake the feeling of being watched. Predictably, Debrina wanted to start using the road since we were in Sersha. She felt differently after we watched a patrol of some 50 Falcon Legion troops coming back along the road we would have taken. Why were so many Falcon Legion troops here? Sersha did not normally tolerate so many foreign troops on her soil. Oh well. A handful of drollish highway robbers attacked us a few days later. Perhaps that was why I had felt watched. The Grolls were too few, too drunk, and ill-prepared to account for much. 2 of them fell, and the rest fled. The possessions of the Grolls were entirely unusable, and we left them there. Let them rot beside the road, filthy beast. 2 days later, we encountered an inn at a crossroads. I recommended that we circle through the forest and approach the inn coming up from the south road. This way we would not be associated with the border. Debrina agreed, and I wondered if she had been out of the doors too long. At the inn, they made us welcome, and although we had to sleep on the common room floor, it was so much better than sleeping in the cold, wet forest that we all woke up in a good mood. We discussed the idea of looking for work in one of the local farms, or maybe working for one of the merchant caravans that often passed through here. The bake girl said that she had to keep going west as she had an uncle somewhere that she needed to find. Debrina said that she would go along with her, and I agreed to go with them. Maybe it was the ale, maybe it felt as if they needed an escort. I'm not certain why I chose to accompany them. But the rest just sort of fell in with us, and it was settled. We went west. The country we passed through was pleasant, and although farmers were out in their fields planting, we managed to remain out of sight. The rains were fewer and the days were warming up. Soon we would need more food, though. It was too early for most fruits and berries, and I just could not take many more meals of boiled roots. In the next town, a place called Glenfrey, the gnome ran into other gnomes, and the trouble began. As in most towns, gnomes are not treated very well, and while this is regrettable, it is the normal way things are done, and one could not expect to pass pleasantly through a town if one questioned the local ethics. The gnomes took exception to some of the taunting and vulgar remarks. People are people, and an adult should be able to shake off the remarks of the simple. The strange gnomes turned out to be practitioners of a particularly gnomish kind of magic that is dependent on illusions and deceptions. Demons, ghosts, and creatures of nightmare pranced after the farmhands. Sadly, the youth Tennard joined into the juvenile display. Along with the rude farmhands, innocent villagers and townfolks were caught up in the mayhem, so I and Debrina drove the gnomes out into the street in the vain hope that it would disperse or reduce the trouble. It in fact only escalated the problem. I was so disappointed in them. Just after sundown, we watched helplessly as the gnomes were escorted by a rather dour constable to the local jail, while Tennard reappeared behind us after having slipped away invisibly. Another group of gnomes approached us with the assurance that they would get Smoke out along with their friends. I did not want to know the details and had the men set up camp a distance from town. Tennard was justifiably ashamed and went too early to sleep, passing up another dinner of boiled roots. Smoke showed up at camp the following sunrise, still drunk and merry from the night's goings-on. One of the men scouting for food discovered a small ruin downhill from our camp, and we went down to see if it would serve as a long-term camp, or at least if there was anything to make it worth exploring. 7 grolls were hiding in the ruin and upon being discovered, attacked. Riff took up 2 clubs from a supply the grolls had and proved to be quite a force to reckon with. Bud and 2 of the other men grouped together and managed to defend themselves quite well. The bait girl stood with Tennard, and the combination proved to be powerful. Indeed, once I had slain my opponent, there proved to be none left. Dobrina stood ready, but none of the creatures reached her position. The Groll camp was a smelly, rough, full of filth, but they had been preying on travelers, and there was a stash of coins, arms, armor, and clothing. The food was utterly inedible and revolting, but they had rope, a couple of tinder boxes, a few packs, canvas material that became tents, all in all quite useful. We returned to camp. Smoke was still sleeping. The day promised to be sunny and warm. We divided up the items, one from the Groll, according to usefulness and weight. The leather armor needed to be thoroughly cleaned, and the men busied themselves. I made up a pack for Smoke, according to what I believed the gnome would want. The bait girl already had rope and wanted a tinderbox. After some bargaining and arguing, we gave her one. Nobody really wanted to make her angry. As the sun began sinking well past noon, 2 hungover gnomes showed up wanting to join the group and team up with Smoke. These were the 2 illusionists from the previous day. They needed to get clear of town. I had doubts, but I wanted to be fair, so we woke up the groggy and grouchy Smoke and let them talk it over. Smoke was not eager to form a team, but welcomed them to tag along for what it was worth. 2 of the men had snared some rabbits, and Dobrina had found more edible herbs and roots, and we had a good supper. This was when Smoke learned about the Groll stash, and I gave him the pack with his share of the equipment, but, of course, no coins. He would have argued, but the look he received from around the campfire persuaded him to shut up and be satisfied. The bait girl, what was her name, had found some tools in the Groll camp and took time to modify a leather brigandine to fit herself. It was a poor job, but she had some protection, and she did not rattle when she walked, as some of the soldiers I knew would have done. The pauldron stuck out like wings, and the greaves poked out when she walked. Somehow she managed to cut down some vambraces so they fit her. She packed extra cloth into a helmet to make it fit. It was awkward, but I've seen worse. I later borrowed those tools to repair some equipment of my own.